Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for Level Up and Avoid the Kryptonite, creating collections for nerds of color. We're just going to wait about a minute or so to let attendees filter in before beginning the webinar, so hold tight. Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Candace Green, and I'm the Events and Marketing Specialist at BiblioCommons. Today's webinar, Level Up and Avoid the Kryptonite, Creating Collections for Nerds of Color, will be hosted by a very special guest, Jewel Davis, Education Librarian at Appalachian State University. Jewel is the Education Librarian in a PreK-12 Curriculum Materials Center at Appalachian State University's Belk Library and Information Commons. She works with pre-service teachers, education faculty, and practicing K-12 teachers on teaching with diverse youth literature, incorporating STEM and emerging technologies into classroom practice, and developing practitioner-based research skills. She received an MA in teaching from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and an MLIS from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A function to pose questions. We'll collect them and answer them towards the end of the session. As always, this webinar is being recorded and will be emailed to you shortly following the webinar. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jewel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to my presentation today. I'm really excited to talk with you and share info about a topic that I'm really passionate about. So for the past few years, I've been learning about and researching issues of diversity and inclusion in young adult literature with a particular research focus on representations of race and ethnicity in young adult speculative fiction and media. And so just so we're on the same page about what that means, the way that I define speculative fiction and media is as one big umbrella genre that has a variety of subgenres underneath, which mainly include science fiction, fantasy, paranormal, and horror. And this is a genre that I love, but I grew up consuming without really seeing much of myself or my cultural groups in an authentic way. And so authentic representation in speculative fiction is one small part of a very large and growing conversation about diversity and inclusion in youth literature and media. And so while this presentation is not focusing on the history of diversity in youth literature or any statistics on diverse representation, I want to step back for just a moment and acknowledge that there may be folks who are still learning or are new to the conversation. And so I do want to quickly provide a slide of resources for folks who may be interested in some of the numbers and history. So on the left, I've included some timelines that provide historical overviews. And on the right, I've included links to statistics highlighting the lack of representation, as well as a link to a really well-known graphic that provides a great visual on the lack of representation with regards to race and ethnicity ethnicity. So I want to start with a very famous quote by Rudine Sims Bishop from her Mirrors, Windows, and Sliding Glass Doors article. She wrote, "When children cannot find themselves reflected in the books they read, or when the images they see are distorted, negative, or laughable, they learn a powerful lesson about how they are devalued in the society of which they are a part." I start with this because it's a really important truth about how we learn about ourselves through the media we consume. And we learn about ourselves in every genre. There's much focus on evaluating realistic and historical genres for accuracy and authenticity, but it's really important to critically analyze speculative genres too, because they do mirror our society, our fears, and our hopes. And if our diverse children are represented primarily in the fears or the bad parts of this really amazingly imaginative genre, we have a huge problem, because everyone should be able to imagine themselves as heroes in great adventures. So that's what I'll be focusing on today, covering some of the common types of biases, stereotypes, and tropes we can find in the speculative fiction and popular culture that feature characters of color and Native characters. So because I'm a big nerd myself, I wanted to present this information in a way that folks who are into nerd and gaming culture would kind of appreciate. So this is a board game map-inspired visual that's unfortunately populated with the common problems we see in books, TV, and gaming. So together, let's imagine and go on an adventure quest through this map to see what we encounter. First up is our setting. We enter into a westernized, whitewashed world. It may be during a medieval fantasy time period, it may be in the future on a spaceship, or a dystopian landscape. What is consistent throughout these settings is that most of the characters are white. Even if the setting is inspired by a real place that is or was diverse, it doesn't reflect realistic diverse populations, communities, and cultures. These populations may be erased entirely, or they may be typecast into stereotypical roles. And the experience of the major characters are presented through a Eurocentric, westernized, imperialist, or colonialist perspective. So this is a problem because it doesn't represent the diverse makeup of our society historically, or how it will look in the future with more of a mixture and blending of cultures. And while our history is deeply embedded in colonialism and imperialism, if we mirror those perspectives in speculative media, marginalized groups are not going to be uplifted or authentically portrayed. So some examples of whitewash settings in literature and media that you may know. In terms of fantasy, we have the Lord of the Rings series. These are the books and the films. They're set in this Middle-earth ancient historical setting with mostly white characters. George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones series, the books and the TV series, it's set in a medieval setting with mostly white characters. For futuristic settings, we can look to Rick Yancey's Fifth Wave book series, where it appears really the only characters who have survived alien attacks in this future are white, or Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game book series, where the future human race is white. So as I'm going along, if you have examples that come to mind, I'd love for you to chat them in if chat is available. I'm always on the lookout for other examples that are familiar to people, because I feel that once you can see these issues in an example that you know really well, it becomes easier to see them in other places. So please feel free to chat in ones that come to your mind as I go through these. So when we're looking to evaluate speculative fiction and media, we should first be asking questions about the world building, analyzing the diverse representation in the setting and the fictional world, and asking, does the fictional setting reflect the diversity of our world? And then asking what mechanics and systems are in place that make the world work. So is this world based on a slave economy, or are there systems of oppression that primarily target marginalized races? Is it colonization with space as its backdrop. Westernized whitewashed worlds become easier to spot once we are cued in to look for them. And asking, why is this a primarily white world and should it be, will help us to continue to critique this common issue. So let's say the setting does have a diverse makeup of people or different cultures. A type of character that we may then encounter is the white savior. And this is a displaced hero who finds themselves among a culture or group in need of saving. And a few character notes about white saviors is that saving is sometimes part of the hero's quest fulfillment. The character often learns something pivotal about themselves that they then can allow them to move forward into maybe a bigger battle or a bigger part of the quest. This character, unfortunately, helps perpetuate the portrayal of diverse cultures as monoliths in need of saving by more advanced, superior, or civilized people. So one really popular example of the white savior is Jake Sully and James Cameron's Avatar. Or if we want to go a bit further back in time to a very similar story, is Zach in Ferngully. A few recent YA titles that have come under controversy for the white savior trope is the main character in the dystopia American Heart and the main character in The Continent. And if you're not familiar with these two titles, I encourage you to read some of the articles and social media around these controversies because they had a really big impact on publishing and trade reviews. And actually, there was a New York Times article that came out just yesterday about Kiera Drake's The Continent, which gets her perspective on the call out that happened around her book and some of the problematic representations. So for evaluating, thinking about the purpose of the encounter between the white character and the other group, is the group being used? Is the relationship balanced? Sometimes you'll see these interactions deemed as okay because a romance develops between the savior and the love interest, but it's really important to consider in these interactions power dynamics and who has the agency and voice to solve the problem or move the plot forward. And if those answers are primarily centered on the white character, those relationships are problematic and possibly exploitative. So another type of trope that you may encounter when diversity is present is what I've called monocultures. And these are basically oversimplified groups or races who have 1 to 2 character traits. So some ways that you may see this in the genre is with the use of stereotypical species characteristics to portray an entire culture. So dwarves are strong, gruff elf haters. Orcs are dark and evil. All Klingons are all honor-loving warriors. They generally have limited sets of characteristics like one language, one religion, one set of values for the whole race of people. And this is an issue because they're frequently juxtaposed against more complex white-dominated societies, which is then sometimes used to justify the colonization or defeat of that very simple race. So some examples can be found in the Star Trek franchise with the Klingons, like I mentioned before, the Stargate franchise with the Jaffa and other groups present. And I've been told races in Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series are monocultures too. Possibly more familiar examples to you may be how Suzanne Collins in Hunger Games and Veronica Ross Divergent series sets up districts and factions to have limited characteristics. And so these two particular examples, not all of the races or groups are made up of only characters of color, but I use these examples in particular to show how our sympathies lie with the more dynamic and fleshed out groups. So when those one-dimensional groups are demeaned or attacked, readers don't care as much about them. And that becomes a grave issue when the groups that are simplified are primarily non-white. So when evaluating, look for dynamic and nuanced cultures and races, not just simple sweeping generalizations that are embedded in stereotypes. Along with monocultures, you may also encounter the placeholder IPOC, and IPOC stands for Indigenous and People of Color. This is a character described as diverse who could be replaced by any other type of character with no real change to the story. A few additional things you may see with different types of placeholder characters is that they have limited explicit descriptions that identify their diversity. So you may miss, because it's only there like one time, a brief sentence of brown skin and coily hair. They rarely matter to the plot and are sometimes background fodder, and they're sometimes used to fill a diversity checkbox. I like to think of those characters as plug and play characters. You just put them in because you want them to be diverse and they don't matter. So for an example in media, I don't want people to get angry. I'm not suggesting that we stop recommending Harry Potter, but J.K. Rowling is really good at using placeholder characters where character backgrounds and race aren't a focus and are minimally described at best. So I think the more recent controversy, if you are familiar with Rowling's film series, recently she added that Voldemort's snake Nagini was Asian and has been Asian all along. That plays really well into the placeholder trope. Her ability to add 20 years after the fact that certain characters are diverse shows that there wasn't much to go on in their descriptions, in the stories to begin with. And so just so you can be a bit more angry at me for mentioning Harry Potter in this webinar, I have to share a tweet that I saw between two popular authors that were making a bit of a joke about the whole controversy that's happened recently. So Jason Reynolds says, "Just drove by J.K. Rowling's house, wild." And then Daniel Jose Older goes, "Careful, she'll claim you were always at Hogwarts and it will be canon." So I'm glad that I'm not like on a stage doing stand-up, because I might be hearing crickets right now or having vegetables thrown. But I say all of this because I do think her work can help spark really great critical conversation, because her series has phenomenally positive impact, but it's not without issue. And that's unfortunately where a good bit of conversation about some of these issues lie, right in the middle, in that gray area, because there's some really good quality books out there with problems. So talking about the line in terms of how much is too much of a problem before you stop recommending this title is a good question to ask and a good conversation to have and look for if you're not sure. In general, though, we do need filler characters for the background of stories. So for evaluating titles with this, I like to ask all of these questions in conjunction. Do the words or actions of characters of color contribute to the plot? How many characters of color are only placeholders in the story? Are there characters of color with more significant roles? So looking for that balance when considering the placeholder aspect. Another type of damaging way IPOCs can be utilized is the doomed sidekick. And this is a character who serves as a shallow foil and is often sacrificed. A few other ways this can play out is that the sidekick or major secondary character with minimal backstory and no major narrative arc. The character can be killed to give the main character motivation to continue in the quest, like the inspirational martyr, or the character might selflessly sacrifice themselves to save the hero or to die honorably. And one of the most popular examples of the doomed sidekick is Rue in Suzanne Collins' Hunger Games series. And a more recent example is Ellery Finch in the popular title, The Hazelwood. So for evaluation, asking, are secondary characters of color sacrificed? That's an easy one, right? But also considering, does the secondary character of color have agency and purpose beyond the main character? Are they a tool for the main character, or do they have their own purpose? So now we're moving into some of the bigger villains. If we're playing a board game or video game, these might be the boss battle levels, because there's a lot of conversation around the issues that I'm going to talk about now. And so the first one is one that we frequently encounter when authors and creators do bring in very diverse cultures, characters, and settings that are outside of their own culture. And that issue is cultural appropriation. And a simplified definition of that is adoption of elements of culture without authentic context. So cultural appropriation is commonly found in adoptions of native culture by characters in Middle Eastern and Asian settings, primarily populated by white characters, and when characters adopt stereotypical nomadic bohemian characteristics. Wes Anderson's Isle of Dogs is a great example of cultural appropriation because of the exploitative way the backdrop of Japan and the Japanese humans are used as props for an exotic setting. If you aren't familiar with this movie, the story is set in Japan, and for the most part, the audience follows the Japanese dogs who speak English and are voiced by white actors. The majority of the human characters are Japanese, and they all speak Japanese, which is fine if there were subtitles and translations. Most of the time, we don't know what the humans are saying because they're not subtitled or translated for the audience. And so because of that language barrier, audiences empathize more with dogs than humans and only interact with the culture of Japan through stereotypical backdrops with elements of sushi eating and sumo wrestling. And so cultural appropriation has played out in YA novels too, including Anna Banks' Nemesis series, which appropriates Egyptian culture, Rebel of the Sand series, which appropriates Middle Eastern culture. Jay Kristoff is quite good at this, with appropriating Japanese culture in the Lotus War series, and Maori culture in the Nevernight Chronicles series. So when we're evaluating for appropriation, think about the context for that cultural inspiration, and if it pays homage or respect to the culture, or if it's just taking stereotypical elements to suit its own world. Another way to think about it is, are the creators of the media invaders, tourists, or guests? So invaders take and destroy whatever they want, when they want it, however they want, for their own gain. Tourists, they're okay. Sometimes they do ignorant things. Sometimes they're just fine. Sometimes they're appreciative and odd, but they don't cause a lot of trouble. Guests, though, are welcome. They build real reciprocal relationships with people, and they're appreciated. There's an author, David Boyles, who talks about how he can't write certain cultures because he hasn't held those cultures babies. So this idea of you can only write about a community if that community trusts you with their kids. So the level of research and work and relationship building that you have to do with a community that's not your own before you can tell that story, I think is a great analogy for holding a baby. So our next trope sometimes goes hand in hand with cultural appropriation, and that's the exotic other. And this is a character who is stereotyped and exoticized due to their racial or cultural otherness. And thinking about ways that this might happen and why it might happen, maybe because the story is grounded in ethnocentrism and or Orientalism, because we commonly see this with Eastern or Middle Eastern characters in white settings. And another aspect that you might see or be more familiar with is that exotic, mysterious beauty character with the fiery temper. I see this a lot with characters who are intrigued by the looks or mysteriousness of other characters who aren't like them or are from foreign places. They'll comment on things like their striking skin color, accent, or their strange cultural rituals. And so this can be really subtle in books like The Traitor's Kiss, with the character always commenting about the skin color or darker characters. But very clear examples of this are in Disney films, like with Esmeralda, who is in a mostly white world in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Or you can flip it, actually, and think about the ways in which we, as an audience, as viewers, exoticize Princess Jasmine in Aladdin, or even Pocahontas, especially when we compare it to how we display white princesses. We can really see that exotic otherness. So when we're evaluating, think about how foreign or non-white characters are described in contrast to white characters, and asking, are these characters on display? Another exoticized character is the mystical IPOC, and that's a character with magical or spiritual powers due to their race or religion. So some character notes is that they're typically portrayed as ethnic magicians, shamans, healers, medicine men, witch doctors, and that mystic's magic or guidance is needed for a main character to continue the quest. So again, using that character for a specific reason. And then cultural rituals become culturally appropriated spectacles. So having respected traditions turned into things that we display or that we highlight to other is one really typical common thing I see with them doing their magic. So an example or examples in media is Jacob Black and his fellow Quileats tribe werewolves in the Twilight series, the books and the film. There's magic in their indigenous bloodlines. Bonnie Bennett in the Vampire Diaries TV series falls into the magical Negro trope. Primarily, Bonnie is a witch whose magic has an ancestral line, and she's used for her magic, and then she's ultimately discarded when her use is over. So for evaluation, watch for the presence of magical IPOC characters and the relationships they have with major characters. How are these characters being used, and are they being discarded? So our final pervasive trope is the dark-skinned aggressor. And this is a savage, uncivilized, dark-skinned character or race used as an aggressive antagonist. They are commonly dehumanized and described as animalistic. They perpetuate the stereotype of dark as evil and white as good. And sometimes we have these aggressors, but we also have counterpart characters, which are the noble savages, which is a docile brute who can now be trusted. And then generally discarded or killed or sacrificed. So examples in media are the Dothraki warriors in the Game of Thrones books and films, the Ghost Nation in Westworld, and then the Shotet in Veronica Ross' Carve the Mark series. And I want to note here, because there's been a bit of chatter about Carve the Mark, I want to note that aggressors are usually darker skinned, but they don't have to be. And Carve the Mark is a good example of this because the Shotet vary in color. They're described as having mixed and blended blood. So they're not white, but they can be very pale. But what is consistent in their description and what's problematic is that they parallel indigenous groups and nomadic cultures who have faced violence and colonization and have been described as savage who need to be civilized. So particularly in spec fic, you could be a purple character and still have a clear racial coding that cues readers into seeing that character as a group that they know that's of color. So with evaluation, thinking or analyzing the aggressors in the narrative and the culture and asking or seeking out conversation or others' opinions on if these aggressors are modeled after IPOC cultures. So those are some of the more common issues. And in thinking about evaluation, it can be very complicated and complex because you can find varying degrees of these tropes and elements throughout a lot of popular media, popular books, and culture today. And you can find more than one of these tropes in single stories. So where we are as librarians, as youth advocates, focusing on recognizing the problem is step one, but then pushing back against it. And if you work with youth or teachers, having conversations with them about these issues and being able to recommend items that counter these issues. So now that we've traversed this land strewn with stereotypes and biases, what's in the treasure chest? What do we get when we go through all of these tropes? So in the treasure chest are some great resources for you to use when selecting and evaluating materials. There's a link, a bit.ly link to a handout and a copy of the slides that have much more recommended resources, but I'll just highlight a few now. So it has a list of anti-bias questions which cover the questions that I asked you to consider while I was going through the characters. It's a bit more succinct in the handout, but it does consider the different things we should look for. There's nerd culture resources like the websites Geek of Color and the Nerds of Color. These are really great online communities that I recommend you take a look through. They feature articles and news and reviews that focus on representation and upcoming media that folks of color are really excited about. And then we have some reviews and collection development resources. The We Need Diverse Books organization, of course, is a great place to start for seeking out title recommendations for all types of diversity. But I pulled out two more, Rich in Color. This is a site that keeps up with new releases by YA authors of color and frequently has speculative fiction. And then Writing with Color. This is a site that dives deeper into some of the other types of representational issues that come up when authors incorporate diversity without doing the work. It's a really extensive site. So I've linked to the navigation part of the site so you can see how it's laid out. So if you're interested in learning more about tropes or stereotypes, you can click on the tropes and stereotypes portion. If you're interested in learning about cultures, there's a portion for that. So it's a really great resource to browse through. I've also included author suggestions. These are all some really great authors that are doing some good work that you can keep an eye out and include titles from them in your collection. I wanted to especially highlight some anthologies and short stories. So these are great avenues for finding even more diverse stories. Our students sometimes gobble these really great diverse books up and then have to wait like a year for the next one in the series. So don't forget about the anthologies and short story websites. So Diverse Energies and Kaleidoscope, they came out a little while ago, but are written with popular authors that your patrons and your students may know. How Long Till Black Future Month by N.K. Jemisin just won the Alex Award, which is books that are written for adults that would be good for teens, but it's a great anthology filled with short stories. Love Beyond Space and Time is an indigenous sci-fi and fantasy anthology. And then I'm most excited about Enough Space for Everyone. It's a comic anthology that has no war or imperialism. So it blew my mind when I heard about this because you can't get away from imperialist society or imperialists in science fiction. You know, building that empire is such a famous trope. So check these out. And then at the bottom, Faya Lit Magazine is a magazine that's online. You can get copies of the issues. They feature Black speculative fiction. And then Lightspeed is another online short story website that sometimes features and does special collections and anthologies primarily with authors of color or authors of different diverse groups. So I want to end a bit like how I began, because books are more than mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. They're stepping stones, they're overcoats, they're anchors, they're quiet corners, they're flying carpets. They're all of these things to our youth, and they should be. And speculative fiction and media has to be included in this. Spec fic is an amazing genre. I love that even though we can escape to explore fantastical and futuristic settings in this genre, we can still learn about ourselves. For youth and adults, it can grant us the distance we may need and provide through metaphor a safe way to confront our fears, highlight our issues, and imagine our futures. So I encourage you to do critical work and review in this area and find the good titles to give to our youth who are yearning to imagine and see themselves in these imaginatory landscapes. So, questions?
All right, everyone, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them using the Q&A function. And until those roll in, Jewel, we had a couple of people share some examples. So an example of whitewashing that was shared was Ready Player One.
Yes, that one is a good one. Thank you. And that one just had a film, so I think a lot of people will probably know that one. So yes, thank you.
Yeah, and then another example that was shared, this one was for cultural appropriation, was Rin Chupiko's Bone Witch series is an example of a non-white author appropriating another non-white culture.
Yeah, there was recently some controversy over that too, just recently. I forgot the author's name, but the book is Blood Hair, and it was a non-white author who was being called out for poor representation too for other non-white groups. So unfortunately that happens too, really. Well, first, finding those true own voices, I think, is the first step. But then when they're not own voices, even if they are of different cultures, we can run into that problem. So yeah, thanks for that suggestion.
Yeah, absolutely. And a white savior example that was shared as well is Dune. And I know that they're making that one into a movie, so we'll have to see how they handle that.
Oh yeah, I'm sure it'll be whitewashed. Because I mean that's just how it is right now. But yes, thank you. That's a good classic one to use.
Absolutely. Okay, so a few questions have come in. First one here is, do you have any specific titles that you love?
I'll just suggest one. I really love Children of Blood and Bone by Tommy Adeyemi. I think it's a great counter narrative to a lot of the problems that we see. She includes some of these tropes, but then completely rips them apart with her main characters. So there's lots of great diverse titles with the authors that I highlighted previously, but with her in particular, she's very aware of what has been a problem and is using that to push back and then uplift this group that's being oppressed in the story. So, Children of Blood and Bone.
Awesome. Next question here is, a number of classic novels are assigned as readings in schools or for school projects, and classic is in quotes. Mm-hmm. Are there resources on these topics or things you'd like to recommend for students?
So with classic novels, I would recommend searching the Disrupt Text DISRUPT, Disrupt Text folks. They're on social media. I think there's a website too, but they do these Twitter chats that talk about all the problems with these classic materials we're using and how to push back, but also, if you have to, how to work within your school to teach those. So I know they've done ones on To Kill a Mockingbird, other ones, all the classics, you know, I think like Catcher in the Rye was done, but they're a great resource to start with, and from them you can find other people who are talking about, particularly in schools, and going against those ones that we just still have to teach that are unfortunately promoting a single story that needs to be expanded. So Disrupt Text is my suggestion.
Great, thank you for that. We have some further commentary on Ready Player One. So Ready Player One, the consensus here is it's kind of a trifecta, because not only does it have whitewashing, it has white savior, and it also has doomed IPOC sidekicks.
Yes, yes. So like I said, you're gonna see many in one story. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Why this happens over and over, why we uplift stories that make this happen over and over, I think is, for one reason, is because we don't recognize that it's a problem. So yeah, I'm glad that you're pointing out and seeing that it is a trifecta of chaos.
Yeah, total chaos. And Jewel, you had just mentioned To Kill a Mockingbird, so we have kind of a follow-up here. Would you consider To Kill a Mockingbird as a white savior novel, or does it point out racism in society well?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a classic example of the white savior narrative. When I talk to my students about this, I ask them, I say, you know, with your kids, after they read this novel, have them write out all of the great qualities about Atticus. They could fill up pages, but if they were asked to write about the qualities of Tom Robinson or any of the other characters of color, they wouldn't have that much to say about them. So really, whose gaze is privileged when we're thinking about TCAM? And that gaze is centered around whiteness and white guilt. And yeah, so unfortunately, I mean, it's a book that, I will be honest, I taught when I was teaching high school. It's one that I've come now to recognize is extremely problematic, and there's other titles that would teach the same types of lessons, but through the perspective of the marginalized group. So yeah, it is a white savior narrative. I'm sorry.
All our faves are problematic.
Yeah. Yeah, and that kind of, some people, well, I'll let the other questions go through, but I was just going to quickly talk about loving the problematic, but I'll let people who have questions talk more or ask more.
Okay, another question here from an attendee is, I have the interesting question of students who are writing stories and are scared of being stereotypical or accidentally doing everything that has been mentioned here. Do you have any recommendations of books or resources they can look at to help their reading and writing in this manner?
Yeah, that writing, or what was the, let me go back. The Writing with Color, yeah. There's another site called Writing the Other, but Writing with Color I think is a good space, and it's a friendlier space. People write in with questions about how they're writing. They'll say, like, you know, I'm incorporating this Asian society, and I have this, this, and this. Is that problematic? And the authors of that website will talk about and break down what they like or don't like about the way people are writing. So I would start there. You know, it is hard. So I would also just recommend whatever culture they're wanting to write about, looking at resources that describe that culture, making sure they have own voices, nonfiction texts that give light to their cultural traditions is important too, because they have to do the research. We can't excuse that. They have to do that research. So, but yeah, starting with writing with color.
Okay, another question here, or a comment about this is, I think this idea of tropes can also be applied to LGBTQ plus characters, either placeholder or sidekick. Could also probably come up with female characters in these roles as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's something about placing any type of marginalized group in the forefront that authors still aren't doing. So yes, while my research is primarily in race and ethnicity, I have found so many times that there's intersections between other diverse group cultures. So you're right. Yeah, in particular with LGBTQ, they fall into these really unfortunate 1 to 2 characteristic types of tropes in, they're the like sassy best friend or other things that are unfortunately limiting.
Mm-hmm. Another question here. Do you see any questionable narratives in the Rick Riordan Norse Myth series?
I will have to be honest with you all. I have not read them. So I don't want to speak on series that I'm not familiar with. I haven't heard, I'm just kind of racking my file of like problematic texts that I kind of keep in my brain. I really haven't heard negative things. I've heard positive things because I think he does incorporate characters of color, and he has one character. Is it Magnus? I might be totally wrong on this, but I think that one character is Black and is a major character in some of his later series. I will point out Rick Riordan has a new imprint where he only publishes diverse authors. I think it's primarily been authors of color who are writing their own mythologies. So I think it's called Rick Riordan Presents. So I don't want to say for sure, but I think he's on the right side of things. But I'm happy to have you, if anyone thinks otherwise, chat in and let me know, because I'm really not as familiar with his series.
Okay, and do you have any examples of effective speculative fiction where there is a white MC and people of color secondary characters?
Oh goodness, let's think. I really, Leah Bardugo's Six of Crows series, Six of Crows, and what's the second book? Well, it doesn't matter. You'll find. You probably know what I'm talking about. Six of Crows, I think, is a great. It's a great series that has intersectionality. The main character is white and disabled. So the secondary characters, some are of colors. One is LGBTQ. Another is just like kind of like Nordic white. So it's everything that you would want in a fantasy. And the greatest thing about that series is that it's not about their identities in terms of race or their disabilities or their preferences. It's about a heist and these kids coming together and doing really cool kid stuff. Kids, I say kids. They're like young adults. But yeah, the Leah Bardugo's Six of Crows series.
And in reference to Rick Riordan, everyone can see in the chat, Andrew just shared that his Kane Chronicles ties in Egyptian myths and has a hero of mixed race.
Yeah, thanks. That's the name, not Magnus. I don't know where I got that from. But thank you.
Yeah, and so in the Q&A here, an attendee also shared a link to a helpful website, disrupttext.org.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I'm just going to copy it over here into the chat so everyone can see it, and it's a useful resource to check out.
Another resource I'd like to point out, it's on the handout too, but the Social Justice Books has the See What We See Coalition, and they're a group of youth advocates, scholars, librarians who do a lot of critique on titles that are problematic. So along with Disrupt Text, you can find some commentary. I find that some people are uncomfortable getting started in the conversation. So hearing what other people are saying can be really helpful. And so the See What We See Coalition is another place to go.
Great, yeah. It sounds like there's lots of great resources everyone can check out. So if anybody else has any more questions, this is last call for questions to ask Jewel. And if
Candace, this is Erica. I just wanted to weigh in. Hi, everybody. This is Erica from Biblio Commons. I just want to weigh in and, again, thank Jewel so much. But I know Candace is going to do it too. But I also just want to put a plug in because we saw Jewel's poster session on this at the Joint Conference of Librarians of Color. Maxine represented Biblio Commons there this year. And I just want to put a plug in for this conference. It doesn't always happen. Like, it's about every 2, 3, 4-ish years. But it's such a good conference. It's one of the best conferences I've ever been to. And I just want to flag it because I think the content of this conference is amazing. And I just want to encourage everyone to send their staff whenever this comes up again. I'm guessing in the next couple of years, and I don't know. And if anyone has heard when it is planned again, please let us know because we would definitely want to be there. And I just want to encourage everyone to send their staff. I think it's an amazing conference, and I wish it happened every year. But again, thanks so much, Jewel.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me. And I totally plug JCLC too. It's such a healing and affirming space. And it's smaller, so you get to really make some connections with great folks who are doing some great work around the country. And yeah, so I concur.
A couple of people are just asking here to repeat the name of that conference. So it's the Joint Conference for Librarians of Color.
I think it's actually of Librarians of Color, but I will say also, I have had some folks ask me, like, oh, should we only send folks of color to this conference? And I would say absolutely not. Like send your staff. I think it's fantastic for everybody. And you do learn so much, but also, all the different sort of groups of ALA are there, like Reforma and everybody else. But the other thing is that people are solving real problems. And I'm not saying that isn't always happening at conference, but I would say that the quality of content at this conference is really amazing. So.
Let's petition them so it happens every year. Amazing. I would like to thank everyone for joining us today, but most of all, I'd like to thank Jewel Davis for this amazing session. We really appreciate you sharing this with us today. And we will be sending out this webinar recording to everyone who signed up. So thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Great. Thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you.